And Steve?
Good morning, everybody.
Take it away.
Good morning. Thank you, Margaret. Congratulations, Steve and John and the folks from EIG. Jared, Amy, Kevin. You know, I was just reading some of the EIG promotional material that all of you can see online. This isn't an ad for them, but I love this because anywhere where you see concerns shared across political lines and the following names: Hillary Clinton, Elizabeth Warren, Ted Cruz, Nancy Pelosi, and Jeb Bush. I mean, just the mere mingling of those names is a brave thing to do. So I'm, no, you might take it, but it is very interesting that we're talking today, and to have Kevin and Jared, both of you are good friends of mine, but I didn't know that you knew each other or would even talk to one another. Amy, you're appropriately right there in the middle. and I guess, you know, when we start sort of thinking about the challenge that both of you have written about, and when I read even an academic paper, a very dry academic paper, I ask myself, if this were a movie script, how would it go? And to some degree, what you both have done in your paper, and I'll just start there, is you offer, in kind of a polite way, a real indictment of everything the government has done to try to sort of equal out opportunity, to sort of look at distressed communities in the United States, low-income realities given despite job growth in the United States, there's lackluster performance, there's less inclusion of workers, there are just a lot of problems which you try and get at, and you say what we're traditionally doing sort of in empowerment zones and enterprise zones and whatnot has failed from your, at least their perspective, and you just whack them. And I'm wondering, first of all, are you being fair to these different categories of attempted economic inclusion? Jared.
Well, first of all, thank you for being here, and secondly, I'm still recovering from being very close to those socks.
Yes.
So
I wear these just in case you're boring.
Yeah, this could take a few minutes. Well, you may need them. And for the record, Kevin and I are old friends and have done a lot together. In fact, I recently commissioned Kevin and a colleague to write a paper for our full employment project, so we're not strangers. Which doesn't mean we agree on everything, but we find more common ground than I think a lot of people in this town.
Yeah.
So to answer your question, I would say that the impact of many of the place-based investment strategies, particularly those that are incentivized through the tax code, has, as we've stressed in our paper, been underwhelming, and I'd probably say underwhelming at best. And I think one of the goals of what we were trying to do, and I think what EIG is trying to do here, is to try to think of where those ideas maybe have gone wrong, and they tend to be quite complex, ways in which they might be improved, and ways in which we might marry a sense of crisis and opportunity, to use a bit of a hackneyed phrase, the idea being that on the opportunity side, there's a great deal of savings, of kind of a stagnant cash coffers, lots of investment dollars sitting on the sidelines, and lots of places that need deep investment, and they're not coming together in a sense that Kevin, I think, is accurately labeled just an unsatisfying equilibrium. It's settled into an equilibrium that's not.
So let's just read the four categories that you whack: enterprise communities, empowerment zones, renewal communities, and new market tax credits. I mean, I have to say they all sound rather Orwellian.
Well, the last one is a little, hive off the last one a little bit.
I know, you do separate it in the paper and say it's better than most, but still not there. But I just wanted to lay it out there because when I worked in the Senate for the Senator of New Mexico, these were tools that we thought, some of them were tools that were important when we were looking at really troubled economic areas within the state of New Mexico, which had 5 economic development zones. Each zone had to have an economic development program and plan. And the kind of toolkit that we had was very limited in terms of looking at how do you amass capital, how do you put it, how do you move it? And it was distressing, frankly, to read your paper, to look at how, one, bad the research has been in these, and two, when you look at it, just look, Kevin, I mean, I know that to a certain degree that tax credits are some of the ways in which you try and incentivize it, but what would you rate as the biggest failure of at least the top 3 of these issues?
I think that really the biggest failure is one of insufficient ambition. And this goes back to work that Jared and my other close friend who I disagree with a lot, Dean Baker, and I have really
Dean
for
Baker
years
up here too. That would
I
be.
mean, Dean and I have written together even on the problems of long-term unemployment, the things that happen to people's lives. If there's a study that shows that if your parents were long-term unemployed, then when you're grown up, you have lower wages. The really negative effects of things like that are very apparent geographically. They're a little bit more elusive because geographic definitions are hard. If you look at some of the things in the economics literature where they're using rivers to decide what the right geographic groups might be. But the bottom line is that if you grow up in a severely distressed area, if we take the same person and move them to a not distressed area, then it has an impact on wages. In one study we cite that's equivalent to the impact of having a college education or not. And so we need to face up to the fact, and so maybe in a really old style Chicago school answer would be, well, people need to move away from those places, but I don't think that that's humane. I don't think that it's correct, and I think it's a national emergency. If you look at the harm to people's lives that's coming about because of really the geographic accident of where they happen to have been born, we need to do better. So again, and I think that really we come down thinking the new market tax credit has been actually reasonably effective, is closer to the right design. But where have the things gone wrong? I think insufficient ambition. But I also think that the way to intuit that is just this: that if we take say a very rough place that's got a lot of damaged buildings and very high unemployment, then if I go there as an investor. And you don't go there, say, then I lose, because I myself don't have enough mass to go in and turn around a whole place. If you go in and I don't go, then you lose. If we both go in together, say, then we can both win. But if neither of us goes, then neither of us loses. There are two Nash equilibria in this game that say one might be playing, and one is that neither of us goes, and the other is that we both go.
So we're going to cooperate, or everyone's screwed.
And so I think that understanding the sort of game theory of turning around geographic areas is something that the previous policies, while very well intended, supported on a bipartisan basis for good reasons, important task, and some kind of letting markets solve the problem that's very attractive to conservatives. But I think that the fundamental game theoretic problem is that unless you design a program that makes everybody kind of know that almost there's a race to get there, and that you can be sure that when you get there that other people, other investors are going to be there too. So if you have really complicated rules that only apply to small businesses, or that kind of thing isn't going to change the Nash equilibrium. And so what we're about in our paper is talking about what might.
Well, I want to get to the solution and maybe some of the other proposals when I look at what you've done, which is a hybrid to some degree of these various plans. I want to jump to Amy, because Amy and her colleague Bruce Katzer is close to a Vatican in thinking, a Pope and Popess. In thinking, it was probably is there a female term for a pope? I don't know if that goes well, but close to the Vatican and thinking about urban development, urbanization, and also inclusion of different economies. And Amy, I know you have some real problems with solutions, so why don't I give you an opportunity to tell us where they're wrong before I get a chance to tell them where they're right.
I think the reason I'm sitting here in the middle is I'm going to say they're both right and wrong, right? So first of all, I want to say congratulations to EIG for the kickoff of this effort. And I really appreciate the fact that as you think about the importance of economic policy, given the nature of the discussion nationally right now, that you've chosen to focus on cities and communities and places, because that really is the geography of the U.S. economy. And so what I wanted to do was first maybe clarify, what do we actually mean by distressed places? I think people have a very probably really parochial view of when we talk about distressed places, what places we're talking about.
Well,
so
what place comes to mind is Flint, Michigan. Does that
Flint,
work?
Well, I would
Is
say
that on one in your scale,
I think
Flint?
Detroit, yes, I think Detroit right now, St. Louis.
So we're on the same page on that.
They are, but I think it's a lot more diverse than you think.
I see.
And so let me just lay this out as context first before we really jump to the solutions. So we look at the performance of a lot of the 100 largest cities and metropolitan areas in particular, because these places make up 75% of the nation's economy and output. And distress is really based on the indicator you choose. And we look at lots of different indicators. So I want to say two caveats. First, it's not the places you always think of. But the second, it's not just the inner city or the urban neighborhoods, which is where most people think of these tax credits going. In fact, let's just take poverty, for instance. 56% of today's poor people live in the suburbs. And I think one of the limits and failures of some of our targeted strategies, it's still going to urban cores. And I think the issues of distress has now really moved and shifted further and further out into urban counties, suburban areas where a lot of low-income workers, immigrant workers, working families live today. When you think of the folks who file for the EITC, for instance, on this tax day, the working poor, the majority of them live in the suburbs. So we have to rethink what we mean about the economic challenges of today. So let me just give you a couple statistics and give you a sense of places. So when we look at, we track something called the Metro Monitor. We talk
Just
a lot.
so people know, because they're watching, where do people get the Metro Monitor?
It's on the Brookings website. You can find it at brookings.edu/metro. And you know, nationally, we talk about the fact that we are now, we've recovered the bulk of the jobs that we have lost since the recession. So we're now in a job positive environment.
Could I okay, you're gonna.
But I was gonna say, in more than 40 of the metropolitan areas in the United States, most of them still face job deficits from pre-recession. Which places are these? These are as
Could
diverse.
I put an asterisk just there for a moment?
Yep.
No, sorry to interrupt you, but I think it's important because one of the EIG charts that I just looked at shows that looks at the level of income of those jobs. And so in the high income or high wage jobs and mid-wage jobs, we're still 1 million jobs short in any of those. Where we're just making jobs like crazy are baristas and low-income worker jobs. But in that mid to high-end jobs, it's just staggering what the economy hasn't produced yet. And that's Jared's fault because you know, he was in the White House. But we'll come back to that.
And
but I just wanted to note that because when I hear the job numbers, I think it's important to look at the quality of those jobs.
I recently had an audience with the president, and he said to me, you know, after you left, the jobs reports got a lot better.
Well, I think job quality is a really important issue, and I'm glad that the EIG report focused on that, and we should come back to this point.
Right.
But Jared is also very adamant about the importance of full employment. So getting to high job demand is important regardless. And so in places as diverse as Memphis, Tampa, New Orleans in the South, in the Midwest, Detroit, St. Louis, Youngstown, even Chicago, is still underperforming the nation on a whole host of economic indicators. In the West, we're talking about Las Vegas, Phoenix, Riverside, California. Here in the Mid-Atlantic, Philadelphia, Hampton Roads, Virginia Beach was a strong defense stronghold here on the East Coast. These are places that are still facing job shortages from their pre-recession highs. We talk about the importance of the fact that most people are not participating in the labor force. We looked at the share of people aged 25 to 64, the prime working age population that have jobs right now. Two-thirds of the 100 largest metropolitan areas have fewer people today in their prime working age population that have jobs compared to 2007 period. So this is not just in highly distressed areas. We're talking about 2/3 of metros still have faced really huge challenges in getting, helping their population get jobs. But the interesting thing is the biggest improvements in labor force participation are in places like Detroit and Grand Rapids, Dayton, Louisville. So even the places that we think of as really troubled are making inroads on certain indicators. And so we don't need to talk about poverty. Poverty in general is also a very traditional indicator for distress, and we have seen the poverty numbers in the United States increase since the recession. In fact, we now have 15% of the US population considered low income, up from 11.6% back in 2000. So we have a lot more low income people today, and they're not just in the urban cores, they're increasingly in the suburbs, but yes, the urban areas are seeing higher concentrations of poverty. What I thought was interesting, and let me just close with this, the 5 places that have the highest, 5 central cities that have the highest concentrations of poverty today are also not the places that you think. The traditional places, Detroit, Cleveland, Fresno, California, yes, those 3 are the top cities with the highest percentage of people who live in concentrated neighborhoods of poverty. but Atlanta, Milwaukee, and the 6th is Minneapolis-St. Paul, one of the stronger, stable communities in the Midwest. And so I think almost every major urban economic engine in the United States faces some sort of economic challenge. So any place-based focus needs to recognize the diversity of places that we're talking about.
So Jared, Kevin, how would you respond to Amy? Because I think what does come out to me in your paper and proposal, let's call it the BH fund, the Bernstein Hassett fund,
hedge fund,
is that it has a focus on real geographic areas. And what Amy just shared is sometimes that's slippery, that when you draw lines that strictly, you're going to exclude a lot of relevant players in the problem you're trying to solve. So what's your response?
Well, I don't really hear Amy that way. In fact, I think what Amy's doing is making a very valuable contribution, and one that's not that complicated to wrap your heads around in the following sense. It's really a matter of making sure that your metrics are the right metrics to capture the areas that you want to capture. It is true that many of the programs that we've reviewed, and you were, I think both you and Kevin were aptly speaking critically of, have fairly simple guidelines in terms of how you opt in, who's eligible for favorable tax treatment if they invest in those areas. And they typically are based off the poverty rate tends to be weighted heavily on employment, job growth. I think if you sat down with Amy and her team, you could iron out a set of metrics that would help you identify the kinds of places you wanted to. That's a measurement problem. I don't think there's anything existential about that.
Can I jump in, Jared, just in the sense that for folks in the audience or folks online who haven't read the paper yet, I just wanted to summarize what it is that we're talking about.
Get the zinger out there.
Get the zinger out there. That I think that we could almost present it as a question for people in the audience, but I think there are a lot of people that have wealth and that have been fortunate that want to make a difference, and they don't have a vehicle to do that. They don't know how.
I actually wrote in the margin that this was the connecting to rich people crowd, that your idea, your model, your vehicle was essentially to take wealth, Silicon Valley wealth, New York hedge fund wealth, and give it a more nimble opportunity to play in these
not just
areas.
that. I think that you know, goodness knows that Steve's a wealthy guy compared to the average American. But your wealth and my wealth and the wealth in this room, I think a lot of us want to make a difference and we don't know how. And that I think that is like the key leverage point that policymakers need to acknowledge, that if we can construct a vehicle so that folks who want to make a difference can, then I think that we could really change social norms.
Give us a quick sketch of that.
So the way, and again, that we do not go into nitty-gritty detail on this yet. We plan to do that in future work because, in part, we have to figure out what things cost.
And you haven't named it yet,
We
right?
haven't. Yeah, what's the Clemons Fund? I think. But you're right.
I'm going to call it today the EIG notion, or
it's not a bad thing to do that.
It's not Bernstein proposal.
But the basic idea would be something like this: that you know, a lot of folks in this audience invest in mutual funds, and when you go to Vanguard or whatever company, and then you look, then they have a choice of all the different kinds of funds that you can invest in. You could have a dividend growth fund or an index fund or so on. And then there are also people, university endowments and so on, but they're, you know, individual investors as well that might invest through, you know, other organizational forms like a private equity firm. And our view is that in order to enable people to sort of invest in the parts of society that need their help the most, that what we should do is define a status, a fund status, where if those funds are constrained to invest in places maybe that Amy defines geographically. Take the Vatican and ask them, you know, where are the places that need this capital the most, and then if you leave your money in the fund, then there's some tax advantage to that, which again we have to decide exactly what it is. But let's just say that if you put your money in that fund, then as it grows, that you don't pay tax unless you take it out. Something like that, even on things like what might be called a dividend or an income that's taxed today if it were in a normal mutual fund. And so if we create a tax advantage for funds that invest in distressed places, then I think that it'll be a social norm that you could imagine. You look at what's going on in Silicon Valley, where you've got all these wealthy people working at Google and Apple and taking the fancy buses from San Francisco. I think it could become a social norm where people say, look, you know, we expect our employees to invest, X% of their income in development funds, or whatever we want to call them. And then that would create a much bigger pool of capital than is available now for these places, and potentially create the positive equilibrium we talked about, where lots of these funds exist. They're all competing to get there first, so that they can start to make money. And then when they do make money, then the thing will snowball and feed on itself, because I think that there is actually profit to be made by turning these places around.
I was going to say, I love this idea of figuring out how we can get more private capital into a lot of the solution sets, given the economic challenges that a lot of our households and communities face today. And I think that, I'm new to this party, by the way, but I think Jared and Kevin have lots of ideas of how tax policies or investment vehicles can help beyond the ones that are listed in their paper. But let me just go back to this issue of metrics. Is that we haven't, tax vehicles, investment vehicles at the end of the day have to fill a gap or solve a problem that we're trying to resolve. And I'm not sure we've been clear about what the goal statement is, what is the problem we're trying to solve, and then using tax incentives and other things to get there. And so, I think that, again, we're sitting with some very smart people here.
But you don't think they've defined it yet?
That's easy. I can address that if you want. I mean, you're asking where's the market failure, and we can easily address that. It's a good point. So we believe that there is untapped demand in the places that we're talking about, and that these places are underinvested in part because of the equilibrium problems that Kevin was articulating, and that if there was an investment vehicle or a structure wherein the return on investment coupled with the idea of a social norm that you actually felt you were doing something good with your money, that we could untap the elasticities and increase demand in those
flip
places.
The equilibrium. Yeah.
So what can the fund, because one of my criticisms of the various previous attempts to sort of deal with these zones that needed development is they were highly real estate focused. And it always seemed when I dug into it that it always felt a little sleazy to me. Maybe you got some nice real estate development, certainly that created some jobs, maybe it cleaned up the look of a neighborhood, but you sort of felt some developer was really cashing in well, and it wasn't clear to me that it really fit the objective that we were trying to sort of do. So what would your fund be able to invest in other than real estate?
But again, it's a work in progress as we move towards the next step, where we have to produce hard numbers of what it costs.
Could
and how
it
you pay
help
for
funding for entrepreneurs?
I think that for me, to be clear, Jared and I went over the paper carefully, and everything in there is stuff we agree about. But as we talk about it, we also agree that we might say things we disagree. But I would say, so for me, I think the way to think about it is that right now, if a U.S. firm, say, locates activity in any foreign country on earth except for Guyana and the Congo, they pay a much lower tax rate, and so they have a big incentive to locate their activity there.
Let me bring another real world problem.
And so why not make a distressed area have a be similarly attractive? So that if you start to locate activity there, whatever your activity is as a firm, then there's an advantage to it.
So can I just jump in? So since you used to work in New Mexico, Albuquerque is the worst performing U.S. metropolitan area in the United States. When we look,
I think when I worked for them, it was the second worst. It got worse after I left.
When we compare them against the 300 largest world cities, and on measures of productivity and employment. So what do you do for a place like Albuquerque? And so the first thing you have to do, I think there's a three-part set of objectives that a lot of, I think, economists and other policy folks are trying to think through in this environment right now. One is you still have to expand the pie. You have to expand the economy, whether it's through output, productivity, net trade. That metropolitan area has to have its foothold in some sort of innovative industries if it's going to survive and have spin-off to other local jobs. What are those killer sectors that they are going to be better at than anybody else? Tax policies could be around sectors, innovation plays, getting manufacturing firms to invest in R&D tax credits to have them keep pace with the demands of the technology and global economy today. The second, so you got to expand the economy. Second, you have to expand incomes for households through perhaps labor force participation. As you grow those sectors, what's the tax play for apprenticeships or sort of other training programs so the employers are really making sure that they're investing in the workers in those new coming sectors. And third, that we have to expand inclusion. We got to make sure that more segments of the population or more neighborhoods are participating in that economic growth. In Albuquerque, there might be different peoples of color, Native Americans, who are not in particular face particular barriers to participating in the economy. What do we do for them? And maybe in certain neighborhoods. So I just think that if those are our three objectives, there are different policy interventions, investment vehicles,
No, I
taxes.
really fundamentally disagree with what Amy's saying, though, but I'm obviously very collegially. We share the same objective. But I think that if you go down that road, you run the risk of having the same problem that the existing programs have. That if you decide we're going to do this and this and this and this, then you don't create the atmosphere where there's a new equilibrium.
Bernstein Hassett gives, just to focus on your proposal, Bernstein Hassett gives an opportunity to play across fields, to see you're
and let
still,
the market decide.
So the market's going to decide.
In Albuquerque they do.
So let me try to find a bridge between the
Let me jump in. What Amy is saying to my ears is not anything that would constrain our idea. It's that our idea won't work nearly as well as we want it to if we get the macro wrong.
Right.
And that's really key. I mean, Amy is right, and I spend most of my life working on getting the macro right. So by which I mean that we have to have adequate demand. If you don't have adequate demand in the economy, you can make all kinds of great sort of supply side ideas, like I think Kevin and I have come up with.
And the needle won't move.
And they won't. We'll be all dressed up with nowhere to go. And I think one of the reasons that I'm here and this appeals to me is that the Congress is dysfunctional. So while you listen to Amy say we have to do this, we have to do that, I completely agree. But we can't, in my view, it's one thing to
not do anything.
It's one thing to sort of just admonish policymakers to do the right thing, and I spend a lot of time doing that.
But let me ask you guys a question about the vehicle, because I was intrigued about this fact that you had, it seemed to me, greater flexibility in what those investments could be. And this last summer, I rode with Steve Case on a big blue bus called the Rise of the Rest Bus, and we went to places like Minneapolis, we went to St. Louis, we went to Kansas City, Des Moines, and the notion of it is that entrepreneurship and innovation are happening everywhere, but in fact, the money pipeline, first, there's not much attention to it, but secondly, the money pipeline is largely going through San Francisco, Bay Area, New York, and Boston.
Right.
And so the idea was to sort of find great innovators, hold them up, show them off in public, give a reward to some of the best ones, but essentially it was to say this country is really great across the country, but we have a misallocation of attention and resources. And it occurs to me that part of what I find appealing about your proposal is that you've got the flexibility to move into these zones to kind of help create some of that money problem in some of the places that are falling off of where the freeway has gone by them.
And it also goes back to the thing we talk about, how Jared and I have been friends for a long, long time. I can remember one place where our friendship grew a lot closer at a moment was just randomly Achenbach from the Post wrote a weekend Outlook, or it wasn't Outlook, it was Style section article where he asked Jared and I to wander around DC, and I think the charge was to look for the economy and see if we could find it. But we started to see the distressed areas of DC and talk about how to make those places better. And Jared made a really good point back when we were driving around that weekend, which he doesn't usually do, so I remembered it vividly. But the point was that conservatives think that, okay, well, if you want wages to go up, then you need more capital, of course, because then there's more capital. Right. But there's no guarantee that when you get the more capital, that the capitalist won't have enough power where he can not pay the higher wage. Right. And I think that a lot of times, conservatives will say, well, if we can get more capital, we've solved the problem. The thing that I like about this is that if we put more capital in Anacostia, then we don't know for sure that we're going to solve the problem, but we get a much higher likelihood of addressing Jared's concern than if we just put more capital anywhere in the U.S.
One of the places where Kevin and I come together on this idea is that I've always really inveighed against trickle-down economics. I've always thought that was just a bunch of fairy dust. But here what we're trying to do is really incentivize the trickle hose to point in a particular area that really needs it. And so I think that has more hope.
I want to open to the audience in a moment, but I guess the last question I have, on the broad notion of laying out an economically innovative, I think EIG will fail if in 2 or 3 years it hasn't had a couple of flops. That it takes risks in the ideas that it puts out there, that it challenges conventional wisdom, that it shows very different ways to do this. And I think this is a really intriguing idea, particularly with the number of the people on the advisory board that exists in these kind of corridors where money are, and the idea of sort of looking at, okay, how do you create an incentive, you know, sort of a Kickstarter for economic development, if you will, in other places. It sounds cool, but I'm interested in just the two of you, and Amy, you know, in your own thing, what is the roster of other truly economically innovative things out there? What are the other kinds of things that EIG ought to begin thinking about?
Yeah, it's a hard question.
I mean, I'll start.
Okay.
I think it would be a great for, basically, my view would be everything in the same kind of model that we're trying to do here. So, I mean, EIG aspires to find bipartisan solutions in a very partisan town, and that's obviously very tricky, but it is, I think, a very important way forward. What about trying to figure out ways in which we can solve problems that typically have a kind of a partisan hat? So right now, every candidate who's interested in your vote is talking about what, you know, frankly, I've been writing about for 30 years all of a sudden, which is inequality, wage stagnation, you know, middle class squeeze. And often what you hear at the end of that discussion is, and that's why we have to do what they would have said anyway. Right? It's just kind of rhetorical, and that's why we need to, you know, shutter the EPA or something like that. And that is a dead end. So I would argue that it would be great if we could, if we at EIG, with our advisory board, who's, by the way, not endorsing any of the stuff I'm about to say, to be very clear about that, would look for similar kinds of solutions where sort of Kevin meets Jared, and, you know, kind of, I guess I'd say, you know, people who are trying to be thoughtful and meet in the middle, can address the absence of full employment, the persistent trade deficit, the persistent weakness in manufacturing, middle income wage stagnation, issues around the safety net. Is the middle, what's a good minimum wage? What's an intersection between a minimum wage and a wage subsidy program? So all the big kind of inequality policies that the candidates are beginning to argue about, they need to get away from where they usually bounce, and maybe we could be helpful in that regard.
What about the idea of, you know, when I think about, you know, the needs that are out there, particularly in infrastructure, and infrastructure can help in jobs, it can also help move in distress zones. One of the big pots of money that's out there that people are debating, and I find interesting, are dollars sitting outside the United States that could be repatriated. And couldn't they possibly, I mean, John Delaney has looked at a bill that would take that repatriated money and basically give it a tax advantage basis if it went into infrastructure, for instance. But what if it went into one of your funds? What if your guys' funds were established and you brought those repatriated dollars in on a, you know, tax advantage, tax-free basis until used? And then you're putting that money to productive use in a way. I'm seeing John Chambers later today, and he's the king of the repatriation idea. I'm going to ask him what he thinks about the Hassett Bernstein proposal.
It's not a bad idea, and
see, that's a tweetable item. Right
it's
there.
not a bad
Kevin
idea,
Hassett.
Steve.
Yeah.
But
I don't like it.
But
that's tweetable too.
To respond,
and tweet that.
to respond to your earlier question about what's the next thing, I think it. You know, at that point, it sort of becomes a little bit of an advertisement for EIG, and I just wanted to, you know, full disclosure, you know, unless you guys have worked out a deal that I don't know about, Jared and I are not being paid by EIG.
No, I know.
You know, we are doing the. You know,
I'm out of here.
But I think that the idea that we find exciting is that that if you have a bipartisan group of people that you often disagree with, but who will. You know, who are convincible.
But bipartisan groups often go bland, right?
But bipartisan groups often fail because what they do is, you know, Jeremy Bentham said that appeal to authority is the lowest form of argument, and it is. But I think the lowest form of the lowest form is when you appeal to authority and the authority is yourself. And that's what bipartisan groups tend to do, right? They sort of say, well, since we're these distinguished bipartisan people, you should believe us. That's not what EIG is about. What EIG is about is having bipartisan groups find innovative solutions, and then, you know, basically investing in them in a way that you know, Brookings and AEI historically have not. You know, hiring the law firm to tell us what the legislative language would look like and what the problems are when you try to make legislative language. Employing consulting firms to help you score things so that when you go up and propose something, you have an idea what the Joint Tax Committee might say. You know, that whole kind of idea, the innovative idea of EIG is the thing that attracts us, because I think that the current ecosystem in Washington doesn't have any player in that space. And to have one where it's not, you know, you're not picking something because you're, you know, this company who has an advantage if that thing happens, but rather because guys like Jared and Austin Goolsbee and Steve Davis and Ken Rogoff have looked at something and said, hey, you know, this is a good idea. This ought to happen.
No,
and
it's definitely an odd bedfellows crowd. Let me open up to the audience for comments, questions. Yes, right here in the middle. Yeah, you need a microphone because you're performing in front of millions watching live online. Tell us who you are.
Yes, my name is Neil Wasserman, and my company is Time Wave Analytics, and we look at long-term behaviors as applied to healthcare and other things. And the issue that I just wanted to bring up is sort of a slightly bigger picture. That is, in economic development in the kinds of areas that you're considering require, I think, three, I don't know, legs of a stool, whatever metaphor you want to use. I mean, one is capital to foster innovation development. The other is demand for that innovation, as Jared had highlighted. And the third, which hasn't been addressed so much, is the infrastructure that allows economic activity to occur. And that infrastructure would include transportation, which diffuses these urban boundaries a little bit, education, healthcare, stable family structure and services. And there may be an argument that could be made to the sources of capital that if you want to make your capital more effective and invested at lower risk, you really need to pay attention to these other legs of the stool, namely the infrastructure. And that gives an argument for, I think, a role for government. That is, this is a
let me respond to you. Can I respond?
Industry partnership opportunity.
That's a great point, and really appreciate your bringing that to the table, because you take us in a very important direction. One of the things that I kind of hear as we talk about this sounds a little bit too much like we're going to fix the economy through sort of volunteerism with a tax incentive. We're going to try to appeal to people's better angels, and that, you know, they'll check a box that says, actually, I'd like my mutual fund to invest in Detroit versus a tobacco company or something. And I think there is definitely something there, you know, or I wouldn't be here. But your connection, the connection you're making to the role for government is critical. I think it gets to it's very much challenged by the dysfunctional barrier that I raised earlier, obviously. But I will say that there is a fairly strong consensus, bipartisan, that precisely the kind of infrastructure you raised, transportation, education, there are thinking people on both sides of the aisle who believe that that's the direction to go in, and lots of economists who agree, particularly as interest rates are low and will be low for a while. So very important to bring the role for government into this discussion.
Amy?
So Kevin and I were talking in the break about what our views were some of these things, and I said I kind of had a slight bias about one of the premises of the topic or this effort was that I don't think the federal government is going to be the solution or driver for many of these things. And so let's talk about infrastructure as an example, but I think as we think about the big idea next, is I do think there's a way that the federal government can really be more in service of the public-private partnership solutions that are emerging in every city, region, and even in the states. And if we think about it that way versus the federal government going to put out a lot of money, but they're really thinking through the ecosystem of innovators on the ground and thinking about how their money can really support the solutions that are germinating from the bottom, that'd be great. So in thinking about your topic of infrastructure, for instance, we have not been able to get P3 legislation through here. We have not been able to get an infrastructure bank. We have not been able to talk about a gas tax increase despite rock bottom gas prices right now. But what do we see around the country? 23 states have passed increases in gas taxes to pay for infrastructure and mass transit build-outs and other modernization needs. And 6 other states are now in the conversations of doing it themselves. Since 2008, 25 metropolitan areas have passed some sort of ballot measure to increase spent taxes or revenue.
So that's government.
It is government, but it's bottom up. And it's also, so I think the energy is, despite some of the frustrations we have in Washington, is there are a lot of citizens and legislators around the country who are willing to still invest. There's appetite for investing in solutions that are close to people. And so I think that if we embrace that and understand it, I think there's a real role that the federal government can play to be better partners.
So am I hearing you say that Bernstein Hassett could bandwagon on that appetite to invest in communities?
I think there's a real opportunity to make those investment vehicles that are now being created around the country lower those tax rates, reduce the risk, continue to match those investments. I think there's a way that you will be able to catalyze a lot of, I think, the solutions that are being generated around the country.
Can I just add that I completely agree with Amy on this one, but the thing about the role for the federal government here is just that it's a really big lever, right? So that federal tax revenue relative to GDP is, you know, a little less than double state and local, and so that if you move the federal tax system, then the amount of capital that you could unleash is really enormous.
Other questions, comments? Yes, right here in the front.
So I'm Alan Orr of Orr Immigration, and I think immigration is the solution to all of these problems. But I further also think that besides just throwing money at the problem, as Steve said, sort of building nice buildings, part of the problem is the innovation, right? The concept, the ideal that people actually manufacture something. And so I think that the concept of someone in these communities actually, instead of looking for a job, creating jobs that work in that community is more important than someone coming there and employing someone, because that employer can move with the economy. So I think there really should be more of a concept on what people think and what the next big thing is as far as creation from the individual than what the government or what anyone else can sort of put money in, because anybody can buy a building and employ people.
Great comment, Alan.
Great comment also. Audience is batting 2 for 2. I recently, it was my privilege recently to comment on a couple of papers that were commissioned by the Hamilton Project, which is a Brookings project, on exactly this point. And I thought the papers were very good. There was a paper by Michael Barr, who's a former colleague of mine when we worked for the Obama administration. He was at Treasury, that looked at both the new market tax credit and also a small business investment vehicle, and look through them precisely through these roles of incentivizing entrepreneurialism in the kinds of communities we're talking about. And he has very concrete, granular ideas in ways in which these programs can kind of simulate the way entrepreneurialism works in the real world. So one of the key things is networks. Lots of people who, and if you go to areas where kind of innovative areas, research triangles, Silicon Valleys, et cetera, you'll find that network effects are very important. You know, people working together, running into each other, I know you, you know me, we know a third guy who's working on something. Those kinds of networks don't exist often in disadvantaged and underinvested communities. So there's, again, an untapped elasticity there. And I commend those papers to you and to our work as well. We should incorporate that.
So I would just say there's a huge debate right now around how you define work, right? The 1099 versus the other tax form. And I think that everyone talks about the fact that today in this environment we're seeing a lot more independent consultants, particularly the tech community tends to hire consultants and independent contract work. The Uber driver is sort of the metaphor for this. And I think this is a trend that we need to continue to watch. What's interesting for folks who really believe in inclusion and really finding opportunities for people of color, some folks are really bullish about the Uber driver metaphor. If you look at the Uber driver, the typical Uber driver is an immigrant, going back to your original point. And so if we believe that in this environment today, or the millennials, is that instead of working for a traditional place of work, but that the young people or the next generation or the immigrants are going to find their own jobs and create their own jobs and create their own mix of income or supplemental income, that how do we support that? I think the biggest issue, going back to your original question, is the quality of that kind of employment.
Right.
And this is where the government does matter. If we're going to go to self-employment as a primary driver of income growth, then those safety nets have to be in place. The healthcare coverage, the other pensions and benefits. How are we making sure that non-traditional place-based work can still have access to those kind of really important job securities?
Right, thank you. Kevin.
It's a really important question. Thanks for asking it. And I think that as we think about if we take distressed areas and make them attractive for a tax reason, I think one of the most attractive characteristics of that approach to me is that it's somewhat, if you design the tax system right, you can solve the demand problem that Amy and Jared have rightly pointed to. And the reason is just this, that if I'm a big enterprise with lots of tentacles all around the country, if I locate an activity in a distressed area because there's a tax advantage to that, that produces a brain-dead commodity, then there's not really a lot of advantage to my organization to doing that, because it has an observable, the commodity has a observable price, and I'm not going to really be able to have the subsidiary in the distressed area charge much of a margin, and therefore I'm not going to be able to expose much of what I do to the tax advantage. If I locate something that has intellectual property associated with it, something that the rest of my firm might have to pay a royalty to or something, well then I can magnify the benefit of the tax advantage that we decide. Now it's something you have to watch closely, of course, but I think that if this system works and it's designed well, then it'll create precisely the right incentive, which is to move the innovation and to move, to require the most innovative people in your organization to go live in these places, because there's such a big advantage to locating intellectual property there.
We're at the end. We're going to have two edgy U.S. senators come up, and we'll talk about taking risks. But one of the things I'd like to finish in is I've been thinking about this session now for a couple of weeks, saying, okay, one of the things the Economic Innovation Group is trying to do is essentially tell everybody, be more edgy, take some risks, think about some different pragmatic ways to solve some of the problems. There's so many reasons not to do things that we've convinced ourselves in this town. And one of them that I've been thinking about, when you think about really unlocking and unleashing capital to do with this, is one of the things, and I know Kevin is not going to like this and Jared's going to love my idea, that if you go out and look at the U.S. economy today, although it's not much talked about in the media, there's still a ball and chain level of debt around households that that are underwater, that borrowed money. It's a magnificent number of essentially loans that are out there, and I have just been sitting here saying, we provide both bailouts but workouts for companies. When companies don't work out, the financial institution does a workout with them. And I'm interested in why we don't see more workouts with individuals, so that we work out the price of the home and we figure out what to do with that debt. And it says moral hazard, moral hazard. Yeah. And what I don't understand is, that moral hazard can exist for financial institutions that got bailed out. Why not give those people in their homes a write-down of their loans and what they're responsible for, so that they have more ability to spend in the economy? You give them, it's sort of debt forgiveness, but then you tie their sale of that home and the gains that could be made and give it back to the institution that loaned it. So you solve your moral. I mean, that could be an EIG paper, perhaps, maybe less well argued than your guys, but why not think about some of those areas? People don't tend to want to touch that.
I think it's a really smart alley to look down. I mean, I think there's many nuances to what you're saying. So first of all, how deep is the problem? If you look at the aggregate statistics, debt as a share of disposable income is kind of back down to where it was well before the bubble started. So I think what you're talking about is very much a distributional case. And by the way, I was noting as Amy was ticking through some of the worst places, there's still a lot of places who got completely slammed by the housing bubble. Yes. So what you're talking about is real, but it doesn't always show up in the aggregate. I mean, this is probably not the forum to have a large discussion about the moral hazard problem and why it's okay to ignore moral hazard at the systemic level, but somehow get all wound up about it when you're talking about households. I will say I worked in the administration when we were staring that problem right in the face, and I would say at that time kind of the answer was, look, it's just very difficult to make an argument. I don't think these moral hazard arguments are easily dismissed. It's very difficult to say to homeowner A, who has just been completely, irresponsible in their finances. We're going to give you a break while homeowner B next door isn't getting that break. Meanwhile, the credit system is kind of collapsing, so there's a magnitude issue as to where you weight your moral hazard.
Kevin, quick thought on my
idea. I think that so I have a completely internally consistent position on this, but it's kind of the opposite of yours. It's just that I think that we have a bankruptcy code. And so that what's happened is that in distress, especially during the financial collapse, that we allowed homeowners who were in severely bad shape to basically be exposed to bankruptcy law.
We have to have coffee. I'm going to bring you over to my side.
But corporations, some of them, we didn't. And so what I would have done is I would have exposed all of them to it, and I wouldn't have, because I think our bankruptcy, like the bankruptcy judges, are some of the treasures of our economy in some sense. They're really good at reorganizing failed things.
Amy, good thought. No, you're.
I want to let other
good.
questions.
Let me one last question. Yes, right up here in front. There we go.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I'm wondering if.
Could you tell us who you are?
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm Raleigh Smith. I'm the president of All Souls Housing Corporation right now, so I'm working in Columbia Heights here. Oh. I was the HUD director in Fresno, California, and covered the Central Valley.
So you know the terrain.
And I know the terrain. I know how empowerment zones work and how they don't work. And I also see where areas have been disinvested, and I'm in Columbia Heights, where in a sense it's overinvested. So I'm recognizing a lot of the, it's not just the matter of getting capital into certain neighborhoods, it's also, it is regional. It's hard to see that
not to put words in your mouth, but is it getting the market signals right?
Yeah, what I want to know is, are you guys looking at sort of the new writings on the new economy that, Jeremy Rifkin and those kinds of people, the next project, there's thousands of new efforts going on around economic invention. Yeah. And I'm wondering if you're really looking, and these aren't people who are looking for tax credits.
Right.
They're looking to be socially conscious and really provide. It's not all going to happen through the market.
Thank you. Let me start with Kevin.
So I'd like to, I'd really like to see you.
It's a really important question, and it's just that the response is that in some sense, this effort that we're talking about today, that's the paper that we handed out, is a narrow one. It's and you're right that the ultimate solution to all of our problems will be much broader, but I think that the narrow targeted solution to this problem of a perceived bad equilibrium, where if we want to convince a lot of people to go to the most distressed areas, then they have to be convinced that their friends are going to go too. That design problem is what we addressed. I think that what happens when they go is a question that Amy alluded to at the beginning, and that you alluded to rightly now, and whether other things need to happen to make sure that exactly the right things happen is the subject of a future conference.
Got it. Jared?
I'll just take another question if we can.
Great. We're going to be right at the end. Amy, thoughts real quick?
Listen, I think I just wanted to go to your point about regional scale being really important, because you can work on neighborhood targeted strategies, but if that neighborhood targeted strategy isn't going to help Fresno, if the Fresno economy itself is struggling. So you need to have that aggregate demand, a strong market to protect those investments that are place-based. I also think you said it wasn't just going to be taxes and private sector, and I think what we're seeing around the country is a lot of public-private philanthropic partnerships emerging to really essentially finance, these big transformative solutions. I think what people are now aren't trying to work on the margins. They're trying to work at scale, and to do that requires these kind of really tricky partnerships between public-private and philanthropic and government. So,
cool.
So again, going back to the idea of a fund, I think every region around the country has very different solutions. What Memphis needs, what they've identified is probably different from Fresno or Columbia Heights or other markets, and I think we just need to let the customized solutions really emerge.
Okay, one short sentence. We have two edgy senators, hair on fire senators, that's a joke. Cory Booker and Tim Scott, coming online. What do you most want to hear from them in the next session about policy-directed economic innovation? Real short, Jared.
I'd like to end where Amy just ended, which is that I would like to hear their ideas for getting the kind of demand back into the economy that's been missing for so long, such that we're not talking about a kind of all dressed up with nowhere to go dynamic where you can flood markets with all kinds of capital, but if people aren't, don't have the skills, don't have the initiative, don't have the jobs, don't have the income flow, it's just not going to work. So I guess I'd like to hear those fundamentals.
Amy, to Tim Scott and Cory Booker.
This is right now a people-less recovery. We need to invest in people. And that requires them having good jobs and the tools to get to those good jobs. So I would like to hear, what are we going to do to create the ecosystem to invest in the people?
Kevin?
Geographic distress is a reality, and I think there are probably no two senators who understand that better than the two that are about to appear on the stage. And I would go back to the first thing I said, that this is a Manhattan Project level crisis in our country. That we have not been ambitious enough. We've been bipartisan at times with sort of relatively small targeted programs. That if we recognize the severity of the problem, then we should be way more ambitious than we have been.
Ladies and gentlemen, please give a round of applause to Kevin Hassett, State Farm James Q. Wilson Chair in American Politics and Culture at AEI, Amy Liu, Co-Director and Senior Fellow of the Metropolitan Policy Program at the Brookings Institution, and Jared Bernstein, cool guy, and Senior Fellow, Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. Thank you, Jared. Thanks, Amy. Thanks, Kevin. Thank you so much. Thanks, everybody.